My name is Paul Woodward. I'm 46. I'm a university lecturer in theatre by profession, but I'm here in Australia to complete a PhD. I won a double scholarship at Monash University to complete a doctoral study in trying to fit disclosure practice and theory with theatre studies. In some ways, the combination between theatre and disclosure, to me, seems like an obvious one. It's one of those things where I'm thinking, well, why hasn't anyone else done this? It's my skill-based. I am positive. So sometimes I think about my situation and I think about, well, okay, I happen to be positive. So what have I got that can make a difference? One of my favourite mantras is a Buddhist mantra that says, the trick of life is to turn poison into medicine. And I really love that. It's a sense that, okay, so this has happened, that's not necessarily a great thing that's happened in my life, but what can I do with it? So my background is in theatre, and I'm HIV positive. What's the hardest thing about being positive? For me, as there is for many others that I talk to, it's disclosure. So I'm thinking, well, can I use theatre and theatre theory in a way that can really help us understand what happens in that disclosure moment? So what happens in that energy transformation? What happens when people try to communicate something that fills them possibly with anxiety or possibly even fear, and they're transmitting that to someone who also might feel anxiety and fear? And at what point does an understanding of what happens on stage, with understanding of actor-audience relationship, with the understanding of script, with the understanding of environment, to what extent all of those tools can we use them to help people disclose in a really confident, clear and empowered fashion? I think there's a paradox there, because we live in a time, of like internet media. We live in a time of WikiLeaks. We live in a time of, Jerry Springer, of Oprah, chat shows where it seems that people are revealing personal information at a really alarming rate, and with a seeming ease. But then put that into a private, domestic, interpersonal situation, and it's really interesting where this paradox that we're so well versed to publicly display an idea of ourselves or a performance of the self, that when there's something really tangible at risk, which is possible rejection or possible feelings of not being loved enough, or possible feelings of fear and shame and all of these things, when it comes into that sort of level, it just boils down to just, as you said, two people in a room going through a ritual or a rite of passage, if you like. And that's why I'm really keen to think about not just placing an emphasis on people disclosing, but people being disclosed to, and what their role is in that. So I think, yes, we could create really comfortable, really confident disclosures, but if we're not thought about the experience of being disclosed to, then I think that maybe, we're not really sort of getting the full power of what can happen in that moment. When I first found out that I was positive in 1999, I really didn't have an idea of where it could have come from. I did have a partner who lived overseas. He tested negative just a couple of days after I tested positive. Everyone was scratching their heads, and it was one of those things where I found out a lot about people's reactions to how my friends thought about positive people, because there was a sense of like real shock, and it was like, but you're always kind of like, well, you only have boyfriends, and you don't sleep around, and I was like, yes, but we can still be positive too. There was a real sort of sense of, especially around my friends that did have regular casual sex, there was almost a sense of why you and not us. And there was a really interesting thing that I found out then, that it was kind of, people were confused about me being positive, whereas I was busy accepting it. I think it triggered a lot of people at that sense. I found out many years later that I'd contracted HIV through a boyfriend who hadn't revealed their HIV status, one of the first people diagnosed in Paris. And I think that at that point, it was so traumatic that he went underground with it. I think it was like any traumatic event, sometimes it can go deep into ourselves to the point where it just becomes a dream or a memory. And so he presented himself as a negative person, and so we had unprotected sex. And it was many, many, many years later that he actually told me that no, he needed to tell me. It was an interesting moment, because a lot of my friends thought that I should be angry at that point, but I wasn't, because in that moment of him disclosing, I saw not just how he was suffering at that point through a whole range of shame-based responses, but also how he'd just been carrying that for years and years and years. And I know that when we were in a relationship, he did love me. And anger seemed entirely inappropriate at that point. Compassion seemed to be the only option because I saw how he'd suffered. And yes, someone had lied to me. But I don't think it wasn't a lie, if that makes any sense. He was distressed. He was traumatized. And why would I want to make things worse for someone already in a compromised situation? I'm new to the Enough campaign. I've only been in Australia for a year now, and I've recently been introduced to it. But it fully falls in line with how I think anyway. And for me, again, disclosure is key there, because I've lived, in the UK, I came out when I was 17, and that was a time when it wasn't easy being gay. I can remember my first gay pride march, and we had policemen spitting on us, and booing us, and I was just a lad, at that point. But I fought and I marched and been an educator, and I know that I've made a difference. And the difference came about through brave people, men and women, just being open about their sexuality and taking a risk. And even those people who maybe didn't want to come out, came out anyway, because they knew that to do so in a particular time and space meant that things would change for other people. And I truly believe the same about HIV disclosure. If the day came when everyone that was positive in the world just simply, then I think something would change. I think HIV education on a personal level starts when you know someone who is positive. To have an actual person say, I'm positive, now let's talk. That's when people's education begins. The more people disclose, the more types of conversations we can have about that kind of stuff. The more stigma gets reduced. But of course the paradox is, if that's the key, if disclosure is the key to the reduction of stigma, people don't disclose because of the stigma around HIV in the first place. Can HIV be eradicated globally? I think it's an inevitability. I think that we'll look back, as we do in any major situations in history, and think about the lessons that we've learned from it. And I believe that it's somewhere in the areas of the propensity of the relationship towards truth-telling, deception, lies, and just our ability to be more transparent and open to each other that will be the ultimate legacy of HIV. And I think there's some really important lessons that we can hold on to that affect everybody, not just HIV positive people, because we're all living with HIV, all of us. We all have a relationship with HIV. I personally think that people's relationship to HIV changes when they know and have experienced face-to-face a positive person. I think everything changes in that moment. And then it becomes a conversation. It becomes a conversation between two people. I think it's one of the most powerful conversations that we can have as human beings. I'm going to tell you the truth now, and I'm going to take a risk in telling you the truth. How are you going to react to that? Are you going to listen? What are you going to bring to the table? What can you tell me about yourself? Am I frightening you? If I am frightening you, are you going to tell me about that fear? What can I have to learn from that fear? Is it me you're frightened of? Is it you you're frightened of? Or are we just frightened? And can we, through this conversation, work our way through that fear to become more powerful human beings?